The incessant beeping of hospital machines jolted me awake. My eyes fluttered open, struggling to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lights above. Where was I? What happened? The last thing I remembered was feeling dizzy while folding laundry, and then nothing. Mrs. Thompson? Emily? Can you hear me? A gentle voice pierced through my confusion. I turned my head slightly, wincing at the stiffness in my neck, to see a kind-faced nurse standing beside my bed. Yes, I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. What happened? The nurse smiled sympathetically. You collapsed at home, dear. Your husband brought you in yesterday afternoon. The doctor will be here shortly to discuss your condition. My husband, Scott. Where was he? I scanned the room, but there was no sign of him. No flowers, no get-well card, nothing to indicate he'd been here at all. As if reading my mind, the nurse added, Your husband left shortly after bringing you in. Well, he said he had to get back to work. Of course he did. I shouldn't have expected anything different, but the sting of disappointment was sharp nonetheless. Before I could dwell on it further, a tall man in a white coat entered the room. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Dr. Reeves. How are you feeling? Tired, I admitted. Very, very tired. He nodded, jotting something down on his clipboard. That's to be expected. Emily, we've run some tests, and I believe you're suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Chronic fatigue syndrome? But I had so much to do. Sarah needed me, the house needed cleaning, Scott's mother needed care. I can't have chronic fatigue syndrome, I protested weakly. I have responsibilities. Dr. Reeves's expression softened. I understand, but your health has to come first. You've been pushing yourself too hard for too long. Your body is telling you to slow down. As the doctor continued explaining the condition and potential treatments, my mind wandered. How would Scott react? Would he finally step up and help more around the house? Would he hire someone to assist with his mother's care? The sound of familiar footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to attention. Scott appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of irritation. There you are, he said, as if I'd inconvenienced him by being hospitalized. When can she come home, Doc? I've got a big presentation tomorrow, and I need her to watch Sarah. Dr. Reeves frowned. Mr. Thompson, your wife is very ill. She needs rest and support, not additional stress. Scott waved his hand dismissively. She's always tired. A little rest and she'll be fine, right, Em? I stared at him, speechless. How could he be so callous? Where was the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd promised to support me through thick and thin? Scott, I began, my voice trembling. Didn't you hear what the doctor said? I'm sick. I need help. He rolled his eyes. Come on, Emily. We all get tired sometimes. You just need to push through it. Push through it? I echoed, anger rising in my chest. I've been pushing through it for years, taking care of your mother, raising our daughter, managing the house, all while you focus on your precious career. I can't do it anymore, Scott. I won't. The room fell silent. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should continue this discussion later. Mrs. Thompson needs her rest. Scott shrugged. Fine. I'll be back tomorrow to pick you up, figure out what to do about Sarah. With that, he turned and left, not even bothering to say goodbye. As the door closed behind him, I felt something inside me snap. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mixture of frustration, anger, and despair. How had my life come to this? When had my loving husband turned into this uncaring stranger? I closed my eyes, exhaustion washing over me. One thing was certain. Things couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and soon. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test my strength, reshape my life, and ultimately lead me to rediscover myself. As I lay in my hospital bed, memories of happier times flooded my mind. I couldn't help but think back to the day Scott and I got married. How full of hope and love we were. Where had it all gone wrong? The turning point came 5 years ago, just after Sarah was born. I was still on maternity leave when we got the call that changed everything. Emily, it's Mom. Scott's voice cracked over the phone. She's had a stroke. The doctors, they don't know if she'll recover fully. My heart sank. Oh, Scott, I'm so sorry. What can I do? There was a long pause before he replied, We need to talk about our options. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully in her crib, Scott and I had a conversation that would alter the course of our lives. I think one of us needs to stay home to take care of Mom, Scott said, pacing our bedroom. She can't be alone, and a nursing home is out of the question. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Of course, but what about our jobs? We can't afford to lose both incomes. Scott ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a sign of stress. I've been thinking about that. My job pays more, and I'm up for a promotion soon. Maybe you could take a leave of absence, just until Mom's better? I hesitated. I loved my job at the marketing firm, and Leonard had been such a supportive boss, but family came first, right? Okay, I said slowly. I can do that, but just temporarily, right? Scott's face lit up with relief. He pulled me into a tight hug. You're amazing, Em. I promise we'll make it work. I'll support you every step of the way. Oh, how naive I was to believe those words. The first few months were challenging, but manageable. I juggled caring for Sarah and Scott's mother, keeping the house in order, and trying to maintain some semblance of a social life. Scott seemed appreciative, often bringing home flowers or taking us out for dinner on weekends. But as time wore on, things began to change. Scott's promised support dwindled. He started working later, claiming his new position demanded more of his time. Weekends that were once reserved for family became filled with important golf outings with clients. One evening, as I was preparing dinner with Sarah clinging to my leg and my mother-in-law calling for help from the other room, Scott walked in, loosening his tie. Honey, can you grab me a beer? I've had a hell of a day, he called out, collapsing on the couch. I felt something snap inside me. Scott, I could use a hand here. Can you please check on your mother while I finish dinner? He looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. Em, I've been working all day. I'm exhausted. Can't you handle it? I stared at him, speechless. Handle it? I'd been handling it for months without a break, without so much as a thank you. Scott, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. We agreed this would be temporary. It's been almost a year. When can I start looking for a job again? He frowned, avoiding my gaze. We can't afford a caregiver for Mom, Em, and you're doing such a great job with her and Sarah. It just makes sense for you to stay home. But what about my career? My independence? I protested, feeling a lump form in my throat. Scott stood up, his expression hardening. Don't be selfish, Emily. Family comes first, remember? We're doing fine on my salary. You should be grateful you don't have to work. Grateful? The word hit me like a slap in the face. I watched in stunned silence as Scott grabbed his beer and retreated to his home office, leaving me alone with a crying toddler and a pot threatening to boil over. As I stirred the pasta sauce, trying to blink back tears, I realized with a sinking heart that this was my new reality. The support Scott had promised had evaporated, leaving me trapped in a life I never signed up for. Little did I know, things were about to get even worse. I thought I'd hit rock bottom, but life had other plans. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Scott dropped another bombshell on me. Em, Grace is moving in with us, he announced one morning, not even looking up from his phone. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? Why? Scott sighed, as if I was being difficult. She's going through a tough time, lost her job, broke up with her boyfriend. She needs a place to stay for a while. And you didn't think to discuss this with me first? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. He finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of annoyance and dismissal. It's my sister, Emily. What was there to discuss? I bit my tongue, knowing any argument would fall on deaf ears. But inside, I was screaming. How was I supposed to manage another person in this house? Grace arrived the next day, suitcases in tow, and not a word of thanks. From the moment she stepped through the door, it was clear she had no intention of making things easier for me. Emily, be a dear and take my bags upstairs, she said, breezing past me to plop herself on the couch. I stared at her in disbelief. Grace, I'm in the middle of making lunch for Sarah and your mother. Could you maybe... Oh, come on, she interrupted, rolling her eyes. It's not like you have anything else to do all day. I felt my cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. Is that what they all thought? That I just sat around eating bonbons while magically keeping the house clean and everyone fed and cared for? Days turned into weeks, and Grace showed no signs of looking for a job or contributing to the household in any way. Instead, she criticized everything I did, from how I folded laundry to the meals I prepared. One afternoon, As I was trying to coax Sarah into eating her vegetables while simultaneously helping Scott's mother with her physical therapy exercises, Grace sauntered into the kitchen. "Emily, where's my blue blouse? I told you I needed it clean for my lunch date tomorrow." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. "Grace, I haven't had time to do laundry today. I've been a bit busy, as you can see." She scoffed. "Busy? Please, you're home all day. How hard can it be to throw in a load of laundry?" Something inside me snapped. How hard can it be? Are you kidding me? I'm taking care of a 4-year-old and an elderly woman with health issues. I'm cooking, cleaning, doing therapy exercises, managing doctor's appointments, and a million other things. And you have the audacity to complain about your laundry? Grace looked taken aback by my outburst. "Well, I just thought." "No, you didn't think," I cut her off. "None of you do. You all just take, and I'm expected to give and give until there's nothing left of me." The room fell silent. Sarah looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. Scott's mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and Grace just stared at me like I'd grown a second head. Just then, Scott walked in, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Hey, what's for dinner? I'm starving." I looked at him, then at Grace, then back at the mess of half-eaten vegetables on Sarah's plate. Something inside me crumbled. "Make your own dinner," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "I'm done." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, ignoring the chorus of confused voices behind me. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached our bedroom, I closed the door and sank to the floor, my back against the wall. As tears streamed down my face, I realized I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give, and if I didn't make a change soon, that something would be me. But how could I possibly fix this mess I'd found myself in? Little did I know, my breaking point was just around the corner, and it would force everyone to confront the reality of our situation head-on. The days following my breakdown blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and resentment. I went through the motions, caring for Sarah and Scott's mother, but I felt like a ghost in my own home. Scott and Grace carried on as if nothing had happened, their indifference a constant reminder of my invisibility. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast, a wave of dizziness hit me. I gripped the kitchen counter, trying to steady myself, but the room kept spinning. I heard Sarah's voice, distant and muffled, calling Mommy. Then, darkness. I woke up in a hospital bed, the familiar beeping of machines surrounding me. A nurse was adjusting my IV, her face etched with concern. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat dry and scratchy. "You collapsed at home, Mrs. Thompson. Your daughter called 911. You've been unconscious for almost 24 hours. My heart raced. Sarah, where was she? And Scott's mother? Who was taking care of them? As if reading my mind, the nurse added, "Your husband brought your daughter to visit earlier. They've gone home now." Of course they had. Heaven forbid Scott miss a day of work to be with his hospitalized wife. Dr. Reeves entered the room, his expression grave. "Emily, I'm afraid your condition has worsened. Your body is showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. We need to discuss some lifestyle changes." I laughed bitterly. "Lifestyle changes? Doctor? You don't understand. I can't just—" "You can, and you must," he interrupted firmly. "If you continue like this, you're risking permanent damage to your health." As Dr. Reeves outlined a treatment plan, tears welled up in my eyes. How could I possibly follow his advice? Who would take care of everyone if I didn't? A soft knock on the door interrupted our conversation. To my surprise, my mother, Margaret, walked in. "Oh, Emily," she gasped, rushing to my bedside. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" I broke down then, years of pent-up frustration and pain pouring out. Margaret held me, stroking my hair like she did when I was a child. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured. "I'm here now. We'll figure this out together." Over the next few days, Margaret became my rock. She listened without judgment as I poured out the whole sordid story. Scott's broken promises, Grace's entitled behavior, the constant demands that had driven me to this breaking point. "Emily," she said finally, her voice filled with a mix of sadness and determination, "this can't go on. You need to stand up for yourself." "But how?" I whispered, feeling more helpless than ever. "I have nowhere to go, no job, no money of my own." Margaret squeezed my hand. "That's not true. You have me, and you're stronger than you know." Just then, Scott and Grace burst into the room, their faces twisted with annoyance rather than concern. Emily, this has gone on long enough, Scott declared. We need you back home. Things are falling apart without you. Grace nodded in agreement. Honestly, Emily, I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. We all get tired sometimes. I stared at them, shocked by their callousness. But before I could respond, Margaret stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. How dare you? She hissed. Your wife, your sister-in-law, is lying in a hospital bed, and all you can think about is your own convenience? Scott and Grace looked taken aback, clearly not used to being challenged. Now listen here, Scott began, but Margaret cut him off. No, you listen. This ends now. Emily is coming home with me when she's discharged. You two can figure out how to manage on your own for a change. As Scott and Grace sputtered in protest, I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. For the first time in so long, I wasn't alone in this fight. I looked at my mother, then back at Scott and Grace. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. She's right, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. I'm done being your doormat. It's time for things to change. The look of shock on their faces would have been comical if the situation wasn't so serious. As they stormed out of the room, hurling threats and insults, I realized the real battle was just beginning. But with my mother by my side, I finally felt ready to fight. The day I was discharged from the hospital felt like the first day of a new life. With Margaret by my side, I packed my bags and left without a word to Scott or Grace. Their absence spoke volumes about where I stood in their priorities. As we drove to my mother's house, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. What about Sarah? I asked, my voice trembling. Margaret squeezed my hand. We'll get her, sweetheart, one step at a time. Over the next few days, I focused on regaining my strength, while Margaret helped me strategize. We knew confronting Scott and Grace wouldn't be easy, but we never anticipated the bombshell that was about to drop. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Emily, it's Leonard, your old boss. We need to talk. It's important. My heart raced as I dialed his number. Leonard, what's going on? His voice was grave. Emily, I've heard some disturbing things about Scott and Grace's behavior at work. I think you need to know. What Leonard revealed next left me reeling. Apparently, Scott and Grace had been spreading malicious rumors about me at their workplace, painting me as unstable and attention-seeking. They'd used my illness as an excuse for their own poor performance and frequent absences. I'm so sorry, Emily, Leonard said. I had no idea things had gotten this bad for you. Tears streamed down my face as I hung up. The betrayal cut deep, but it also ignited a fire within me. No more playing the victim. Mom, I called out, my voice steadier than it had been in years. We need to act now. Together, we crafted a plan. With Leonard's help, we compiled evidence of Scott and Grace's misconduct, including emails and witness statements. Then we contacted their company's HR department. The response was swift and decisive. Within days, both Scott and Grace were suspended pending an investigation. The news spread quickly, and suddenly, my phone was buzzing with messages of support from old colleagues and friends. But the real test came when Scott showed up at Margaret's house, his face a mask of fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? He shouted as I opened the door. You're ruining everything. I stood my ground, looking him straight in the eye. No, Scott, you did that all on your own. He tried to push past me, but Margaret appeared, standing tall beside me. You need to leave, Scott, she said firmly, unless you want us to call the police. As he stormed off, hurling threats and insults, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was standing up for myself. But our victory was short-lived. The next day, I received a call from my lawyer. Scott was filing for full custody of Sarah, claiming I was an unfit mother due to my health issues. My world tilted on its axis. The thought of losing Sarah was unbearable. I collapsed onto the couch, my breath coming in short gasps. Margaret sat beside me, her arm around my shoulders. Emily, listen to me. We're not going to let this happen. You're a wonderful mother, and we have proof of Scott's negligence. We'll fight this. I looked up at her, drawing strength from her unwavering support. You're right, I said, wiping away my tears. I've come too far to give up now. In that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of our lives forever. I wasn't just going to fight for custody. I was going to expose Scott and Grace for who they truly were. I picked up my phone and dialed Leonard's number. "Leonard, it's Emily. I need your help one more time. It's time to tell our story." As I hung up, I felt a mix of fear and determination. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for every person who'd ever been silenced or taken for granted. The battle was far from over, but I was ready to fight. And this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. The day of the custody hearing arrived with a suffocating tension. As I sat in the courthouse waiting room, my hands trembled despite Margaret's reassuring presence beside me. Scott and Grace hadn't arrived yet, but their absence only heightened my anxiety. "You've got this, Emily," Margaret whispered, squeezing my hand. "Remember, we have the truth on our side." I nodded, trying to draw strength from her words. Just then, the doors burst open and Scott strode in with Grace close behind. Their faces were masks of cold determination, and my heart sank at the sight. "Emily," Scott sneered, his voice dripping with disdain, "I hope you're ready to say goodbye to Sarah. No judge in their right mind would grant custody to someone as unstable as you." Before I could respond, Grace chimed in. "Really, Emily, this whole charade is pathetic. Just give up now and save everyone the trouble." I felt my resolve wavering under their cruel words, but Margaret stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "That's enough, both of you. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Scott opened his mouth to retort, but was interrupted by a familiar voice behind us. I couldn't agree more. We all turned to see Leonard standing there, a portfolio tucked under his arm and a determined expression on his face. "Leonard?" Scott sputtered, his composure cracking. "What are you doing here?" Leonard stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "I'm here to make sure the truth comes out, Scott. All of it." The color drained from Scott and Grace's faces as Leonard began to speak. He detailed their workplace misconduct, the lies they'd spread about me, and the evidence he'd gathered of their neglect and emotional abuse. "I have sworn statements from colleagues," Leonard continued, his voice steady and clear. "They all attest to Scott and Grace's behavior and the toll it took on Emily, not to mention the records of Emily's medical condition, directly resulting from the stress they put her under." Scott's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this," he shouted, lunging towards Leonard. In that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. I saw Scott's fist flying towards Leonard's face, heard Margaret's gasp of shock, and felt a surge of adrenaline course through my body. Without thinking, I stepped between them, my hand shooting up to catch Scott's wrist mid-air. "Stop!" I commanded, my voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. The room fell silent, all eyes on us. Scott stared at me, shock and confusion replacing his anger. "This ends now," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not your punching bag anymore, Scott. I'm not your maid, or your scapegoat, or your doormat. I'm a person, a mother, and I deserve respect." I turned to face the stunned onlookers, including our lawyer and the court officials who had rushed in at the commotion. "This is who they really are," I declared, gesturing to Scott and Grace. "Bullies who resort to violence when they don't get their way. Is this really who you think should have custody of a child?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, people began to nod. I saw looks of sympathy and understanding replace the doubt and skepticism that had been there before. As security guards approached to escort Scott and Grace out, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained and vulnerable. But as I looked around at the supportive faces of Margaret, Leonard, and even strangers who had witnessed the scene, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone anymore. I had found my voice, and people were finally listening. As we were called into the courtroom, Margaret squeezed my hand one last time. "You did it, Emily," she whispered. "No matter what happens now, you've already won." I took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I truly believed I could win. The courtroom felt like a battlefield as I took the stand. Scott's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp suit, approached with a predatory smile. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You claim my client has been neglectful, yet you willingly quit your job to care for his mother. Wasn't that your choice?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. It was a decision we made together, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Scott promised to support me. He didn't. The lawyer's smile tightened. And yet you never sought employment again. Isn't it true that you became dependent on my client? I felt a flash of anger. I was caring for his mother, our daughter, and managing our home. That is work, even if it's unpaid. As the questioning continued, I could see Scott and Grace whispering to each other, smug smiles on their faces. But I refused to let them intimidate me. I recounted every broken promise, every dismissive comment, every moment I felt invisible in my own home. When it was our turn, Leonard took the stand. He presented emails, performance reviews, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of Scott and Grace's behavior at work and their lies about me. Your Honor, Leonard concluded, his voice firm, Emily Thompson is not only a capable and loving mother, but also a victim of prolonged emotional abuse and neglect. The judge's expression was unreadable as she called for a recess. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt a mix of hope and terror. Had we done enough? In the hallway, Scott cornered me, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won? He hissed. I'll make sure you never see Sarah again. You're nothing without me, Emily. Nothing. I stood my ground, even as my heart raced. You're wrong, Scott. I'm everything I need to be, with or without you. Just then, Margaret appeared at my side, her presence a shield against Scott's venom. Step away from my daughter, she warned, her voice low and dangerous. As Scott retreated, I felt a surge of gratitude for my mother's unwavering support. But the moment was short-lived as we were called back into the courtroom. The judge's decision felt like it took an eternity. With each passing second, my anxiety grew. What if she didn't believe me? What if I lost Sarah? In the matter of custody, the judge began, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Emily Thompson. The world seemed to stop. I heard Margaret's gasp of joy, saw Scott's face contort in disbelief, but it all felt distant, unreal. Furthermore, the judge continued, given the evidence presented, I'm granting Mrs. Thompson's petition for divorce on grounds of emotional cruelty. Mr. Thompson will pay alimony and child support as outlined in the settlement proposal. As the reality of the judge's words sank in, I felt a tidal wave of emotions threaten to overwhelm me. Relief, joy, vindication, but also a deep, aching sadness for the life I had lost and the years I could never get back. Outside the courtroom, as reporters clamored for statements and Scott and Grace skulked away in defeat, I turned to Margaret and Leonard. Thank you, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't have done this without you. Margaret pulled me into a fierce hug. You did this, Emily. You found your strength. Leonard nodded, smiling warmly. You've got a bright future ahead, Emily, and if you ever want to return to work, there's a place for you at the company. As we walked out of the courthouse, I felt like I was stepping into a new world. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt hope. I had my daughter, my freedom, and a chance to rediscover who Emily Thompson really was. The battle was over, but my journey was just beginning. And this time I was ready to face whatever came next, on my own terms. 6 months after the divorce, I stood in front of the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at me. Gone were the dark circles under my eyes and the perpetual look of exhaustion. In their place was a spark of life I hadn't seen in years. Mommy, are you ready? Sarah called from the living room, her voice filled with excitement. I smiled, adjusting my blouse one last time. Coming, sweetie. As we drove to Sarah's first day of kindergarten, I marveled at how much had changed. With the settlement from the divorce, I'd been able to buy a small house for us, close to my mother and in a good school district. I'd even started working part-time at Leonard's company, slowly rebuilding my career. Dropping Sarah off at school, I felt a pang of emotion. Have a great day, honey, I said, hugging her tight. Mommy loves you. As I watched her skip into the classroom, I realized how far we'd both come. No longer was she the timid child afraid of her father's mood swings. She was blossoming, free from the tension that had once filled our home. Returning home, I found a familiar car parked in my driveway. My heart sank as I saw Scott leaning against it, a bouquet of flowers in his hand. Emily, he said as I approached, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Can we talk? I hesitated, then nodded, leading him to the porch. We sat in silence for a moment before he spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Scott began. And I'm sorry for everything. I was a terrible husband and father. I took you for granted, and I see that now. I listened, my emotions a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and a tiny flicker of the love we once shared. I've changed, he continued, hope creeping into his voice. I've been going to therapy, working on myself. I want us to try again, for Sarah's sake, and for ours. For a moment, I was tempted. The idea of a whole family, of the life I'd once dreamed of, dangled tantalizingly before me. But then I remembered. The lonely nights, the constant criticism, the feeling of invisibility. I remembered the strength it took to stand up for myself, to build this new life. No, Scott, I said firmly, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. I'm glad you're working on yourself, truly, but we can't go back. I've moved on, and so should you. His face fell, a mix of disappointment and anger flashing in his eyes. For a second, I saw the old Scott, the one who would lash out when he didn't get his way. But instead, he nodded slowly. I understand. I hope someday you can forgive me. As I watched him drive away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The last tie to my old life had been severed, and I was truly free. That evening, as Sarah and I sat at our little dining table, eating dinner and giggling over her stories from school, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. Mommy, Sarah said suddenly, her little face serious. Are you happy now? I looked at her, this beautiful child who had been my anchor through the storm, and felt tears prick my eyes. Yes, sweetheart, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. Mommy is very happy. Later, as I tucked Sarah into bed, I thought about the journey we'd been on. The pain, the struggle, the moments of despair, but also the triumph, the rediscovery of my strength, and the unbreakable bond I'd formed with my daughter. I realized then that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, a chance to write a new story, one where I was the author of my own happiness. As I closed Sarah's bedroom door, I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. For the challenges that had shaped me, for the people who had supported me, and for the strength I'd found within myself. Tomorrow was a new day, full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, I couldn't wait to see what it would bring.